Okay, so you guys have really given us a lot to think about this time
Wow.
with these sources. We have 2 articles from actualite.cd, and then this really intense video report from TV5 Mon on D Info, and it's
Mhm.
all about what's going on in Kinshasa right now.
Yeah, Kinshasa definitely seems to be having a rough time.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see these immediate crises like with the floods,
Yeah.
and then it's like, wait a second, these sources are kind of pointing to some bigger issues.
Right, exactly. And I think that's what we're going to try to do today is kind of dig into both those things,
Yeah.
like what's happening right now, but also how do we get here?
Exactly. Like,
Yeah.
what are those longer term challenges that are making these immediate crises even worse?
Right, and how are they all connected?
Exactly.
Yeah, so maybe we can start with the floods just to kind of lay the groundwork because that's really you know,
The big news.
yeah, it's the big news right now. It's that visual that we all saw in that TV5 Mon and D video.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Yeah.
think that's what's so powerful about that video is
Yeah.
you don't just get like the facts and figures you see, and you hear the impact.
Right, and we know those floods were triggered by those really heavy rains that hit Kinshasa.
Right, Friday night into Saturday.
Yeah, on the 4th into the 5th of April
That's right, 2025.
of 2025. Yeah, and it sounds like the Gill River just completely overflowed.
Yeah, they were saying that there was just no way for it to handle that much water.
Right, and I think the video really captures that sense of like, oh my gosh, this is happening right now. Like you said, there's that footage of people trying to escape the water.
Oh yeah, like clinging to pieces of wood or
Yeah.
whatever they could find, just trying to make a raft.
Right, or just swimming.
Swimming, yeah. Some people were even trying to walk through it.
And it's just chaos. Like you can hear it in the reporter's voice too.
Oh, totally.
Yeah,
You can tell that even they're shaken by what they're seeing.
right. And then they start listing all the damage, like shops are destroyed, vehicles are underwater,
Yeah, houses are literally collapsing.
and people are trapped.
Yeah, they were talking about people being trapped in their homes. Some people had to climb onto their roofs to escape.
Yeah, and it's just really tragic because there were reports of deaths too, and I think that's what makes it so real.
Absolutely. It's not just like a news story. It's actual people's lives being completely upended.
And then you have that RFLAF article that really puts a human face on it. They talk about the families who've been impacted.
Right. And they specifically highlight the women and children who are now homeless.
Yeah, they're saying that those groups are especially vulnerable.
Yeah. They might not have the same resources or support networks.
Right, and they're calling on the government to step up and do more.
Yeah. They specifically mentioned the Ministry of Gender, Family, and Children.
Hmm.
They're like, hey, you need to be doing more to help these people.
Yeah, they're asking for things like emergency shelter and psychological support and healthcare.
Right. They're basically saying these folks need immediate help, but they also need ongoing support to deal with the trauma and the long-term impacts of this disaster.
And I think that's something that sometimes gets overlooked in these kinds of situations. It's not just about the immediate physical needs.
Right. It's the emotional and mental health toll as well.
Exactly. And the RFLAF is really pushing for that to be addressed.
Yeah, they're advocating for a more holistic approach to disaster relief.
And the TV5 Mondan report also hints at some of the bigger issues that made these floods so bad. Like they talk about how there aren't enough secondary roads in Kinshasa.
Right. So when the main road flooded, there was nowhere else for people to go.
Yeah, they specifically mention Lumumba Boulevard, which is like a major artery in the city, and it became completely impassable.
Yeah, that's a huge problem when you think about it. 17 million people in Kinshasa and only a few major roads to get around.
Right, and they point to the drainage systems as being really poorly maintained.
Yeah, they were talking about all the trash and debris that clogs up the drains. So when these heavy rains hit, the water has nowhere to go.
Exactly. So it's not just a case of like, oh, this was a freak rain event. It's like,
There were underlying issues.
yeah, there were already these weaknesses in the city's infrastructure.
Exactly. And then the floods just kind of exposed them.
Right, so now we're seeing the consequences.
Big deal.
Okay, so we've talked about the floods and the immediate crisis, but then there's that other actualite.cd article that talks about the challenges women in Kinshasa face with getting around the city.
Right. And it almost seems like a separate issue, but when you think about it, it's all connected.
Totally. Because if you're already struggling to get around on a normal day.
Imagine what it's like during a natural disaster.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
So this article is really highlighting these everyday struggles that women are dealing with.
Yeah, and it's not just about inconvenience. It's about safety. It's about affordability. It's about basic access to transportation.
Yeah, there's that quote from Muriel and Kemba, where she talks about trying to find a taxi during rush hour.
Oh, yeah, she says it's a real headache.
Yeah, and then she goes on to describe how she constantly has to be on guard.
Right, she talks about the harassment, the unwanted attention, the physical contact.
And it's just this feeling of being unsafe, just trying to get around the city.
Right, it's like your basic freedom of movement is being compromised.
And they point out that it's not just limited to public transport.
Right, even the moto taxis, which are super common in Kinshasa.
Those are the wiwa, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the article says that women often feel unsafe using those too, especially in poorer areas.
There's that quote from Cynthia Bassa where she says she sometimes avoids going out altogether because she's afraid of being harassed.
Right, or she has to pay more for a private taxi just to feel safe.
So it's like her mobility is limited by these safety concerns.
Exactly, and that has a ripple effect on everything else she does.
And then there's the issue of accessibility, like just finding a bus stop or a place to catch a taxi can be a challenge.
Yeah, especially if the infrastructure is old or poorly maintained.
Right. They talk about Aminata Willow, who's a single mother and a trader, and she often has to walk really long distances just to find transportation.
Yeah, especially during the rainy season.
Right, which is when the floods happen.
Right, so it's like a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And she talks about how exhausting it is and how it costs her time and money.
Right, because if you're spending hours each day just trying to get to work or to the market, that's time that you're not earning money.
Exactly. And then the article talks about the problem of overcrowding.
Oh yeah, the buses and minibuses are often packed.
And women end up having to stand.
In these cramped, uncomfortable conditions.
Yeah, that sounds really awful.
Especially in a hot climate like Kinshasa.
And then all of this contributes to the financial burden on women.
Right, because even if the fares are relatively low, the cost of transportation adds up over time.
Yeah, Joyce Mwanza makes this really interesting point where she says that mobility can feel like a luxury.
Yeah, like if you can afford to take a private taxi, you have more freedom and more opportunities.
Right, but if you're stuck relying on these unreliable and unsafe forms of public transport, it really limits what you can do.
Exactly. And she ends by saying that if Kinshasa could address these mobility challenges,
Like if transportation was safer and more accessible and more affordable.
yeah, then women could really participate
Yeah.
more fully in the economy and in society.
Right, so it's not just about getting from point A to point B. It's about empowering women.
Totally. It's about giving them the same opportunities as everyone else.
And I think that's where these two articles and the video really converge.
Right. Because the floods have shown us just how vulnerable women are when the transportation system is disrupted.
Exactly. And it's like the same things that made the flood so bad, the lack of good roads, the poor drainage.
Those are the same things that made transportation a daily struggle for women.
Yeah, it's all interconnected.
Absolutely.
So what we're seeing in Kinshasa is this really complex situation where you have a natural disaster that's causing immediate suffering,
Right.
but it's also highlighting these longer-term challenges that were already there.
Right, like the inadequate infrastructure and the lack of safety for women.
Exactly. And I think the big question that comes out of all of this is what can be done to address these issues.
Yeah, like how can we make Kinshasa a more resilient city, both in terms of dealing with natural disasters and in terms of creating a more equitable and just society for everyone?
Exactly. And I think that's where you guys come in.
Right, so think about it. Like, what role can the government play? What can community organizations do? What about international aid agencies?
Yeah, like what kind of solutions would actually make a difference in the long term?
And how can we ensure that those solutions are inclusive and that they benefit everyone, not just a select few?
Because at the end of the day, it's about creating a city where everyone can thrive.
Absolutely, a city that's both resilient and just.
And that's something worth striving for.
I agree.
So keep thinking about it and let us know what you come up with.
We'll be back next time with another deep dive.
Until then, stay curious.
And keep exploring.